Well, it's a cold and gloomy late December day. Christmas is over and we have a leftover ham bone, so we're going to make that into soup. I'm using a recipe from Diane Devereux's cookbook, The Complete Guide to Pressure Canning. And I'll put a link in the description box below. This is the book. You can find it on Amazon.com. The recipe I'm following, page 128, ham and navy bean soup, but I'm going to use a 15 bean soup. And I'll put the recipe and the ingredients in the description box below, but here are the ingredients you're going to need. So if you want to take a screenshot, you can do that. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to say this is not a USDA approved recipe. USDA does not approve of canning cured meats because nobody has officially tested them, and because of the density of the meats that have been cured, they're not sure about the amount of heat penetration they require for canning. So what I'm going to do is make sure my ham pieces are very, very tiny so that I can make sure that they're properly processed and the heat will transfer through them completely. So let's get started. All right, today we have a leftover Christmas ham. We're going to make ham and bean soup. And this is the remnants of a 10-pound ham. It's a bone with quite a bit of meat. And we're going to prepare this for canning. And I'm following a recipe that's going to make about 6 to 7 quarts. So I'll be able to use my small Presto stovetop pressure canner. So let's get started. A package of the beans of your choice. I'm using ham beans 15 bean, but you can use all white beans, all pinto beans, whatever kind of beans you like. So one of these packages is just a little over a pound, 20 ounces. You're going to rinse them. Then you add them to a pot, cover with 2 inches of water. We'll bring this to a boil and let it boil for 5 minutes. And then we will cover it and let it simmer for another 30 minutes. This is just enough to tenderize the beans, but not completely cook them. All right, our beans are starting to boil. We're going to boil them for 5 minutes. After that 5 minutes is up, I'm going to turn this down to a medium-low and just let it simmer with the lid on for 30 minutes. So I'm going to count my 5 minutes, and then we'll allow these beans to simmer in the warm water for 30 minutes after that. So the key with beans when you're pressure canning, and they must be pressure canned, you cannot water bath can beans. The key is you don't want them fully cooked when they go into the canner. You want them to be sort of the tender, firm stage. And that's because while they're in the canner, they're going to fully cook the rest of the way. So we have boiled these for 5 minutes. Of course, they're nowhere near ready. They've got to still simmer and then cook a little longer, but we're going to cover this now. I'm going to put them on the back burner and turn the heat down to fairly low, and we will be back. So now our beans that have boiled for 5 minutes are on the back burner under a low heat. I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes. And after that, we will turn the heat off and just let them sit. Meantime, I'm going to prepare the ham. Okay, so I've got a lot of meat left. I separated this. I'm going to keep this meat for sandwiches, and I'm going to use the bone for the soup. Okay, I've got the pot that I'm going to cook everything, and at the end of the process, the beans will add into this pot also. So you want a fairly large pot. A little vegetable oil. Important to not use butter because you don't want to use butter or dairy products in canning. And you can't safely process your foods if they have dairy products or thickeners and that kind of stuff in them. The dairy products have fats in them, and fats tend to shield the botulism spores so that they could proliferate in your food, and you don't want to take any chance of that happening. Okay, so we've got this on a medium-high heat. We've chopped up an onion and some garlic. We're going to let that saute here for just a minute or two to soften everything. Okay, so we're going to let this saute for about 6 or 8 minutes till the onions are a little bit soft. I don't want them too soft because just as with the beans, they're going to really soften up in the canner. So we don't want to overcook them, but just a little bit soft. And how do I know that beans will overcook in the canner? Because I made ham and beans and canned them as a leftover last summer. And this is how they turned out. The beans sort of did not survive the process. They got mushy. So we don't want that. These have cooked for a couple of minutes. We're now going to add 4 cups of broth. The recipe calls for vegetable broth, but I'm going to use chicken broth, and this is low sodium. Because our ham has a lot of salt. It's a delicious Costco ham. It was very sweet and salty. It's going to make a great soup. But there is 4 cups of broth. The broth of your choice. We've got the onion and garlic in there, and now we're going to add in our ham bone. And I have a little extra end piece of ham here. Okay, so we're going to bring this to a boil. We'll bring it to a boil like we did with the beans. Boil it for 5 minutes. Then we'll reduce it to a simmer for 30 minutes. Whoops, almost forgot to add our bay leaves. So a couple of large or several small bay leaves. I have small only. I've got our heat up. We're still waiting for this to sort of come to a boil. Okay, my 30-minute timer rang, so I have turned off the heat on the beans and I'm just going to let them sit. So no heat. They're just going to sit until the ham is ready to go. And you can see I've sort of cut this into more manageable hunks there. Got the bone into the broth so that the bone marrow will cook nicely. We're going to let this boil at a hard boil for 5 minutes. And then we're going to cover the pot and let it simmer for 30 minutes, just like we did with the beans. Our soup base is starting to boil. By the way, this is a 6.5 quart Dutch oven. You can use a stock pot or whatever you have that's about 6.5, 7 quarts. And it's boiling. We're going to start timing for 5 minutes. And after that, we'll cover our pot and let it simmer for 30 minutes. It's boiling really nicely now. I've got a couple minutes left to go in the 5 minutes, but I just wanted to tell you that I did add a couple more cups of broth to this because I thought it needed it. I didn't seem to have enough broth in there, so I have, instead of 4 cups as the recipe called for, I've got about 5.5 cups of broth. And as soon as my 5 minutes is up, we're going to cover this pot, turn it down to a low simmer for 30 minutes. All right, our timer has sounded. The 5 minutes of boiling is up. I'm going to turn my heat down so that this just simmers for the next 30 minutes with the lid on. So we're going to set the timer again for 30 minutes and then we'll come back. Okay, now we're coming to the final phase of the project. I have gotten my pressure canner here ready to go, 3 quarts of water. So I have my 7-quart jars here. I'm going to scrub these with soap and water, rinse them well. I wanted to show you the difference between the wide mouth and the regular mouth quarts. These wide mouth quarts, when I'm washing them or when I'm preparing something in them, I can actually fit my hand into the jar to really wash them and clean them. Whereas with the narrow mouth, you can't. Now these are really good for storing more liquidy materials, and if you have more of a solid food that you're going to can, such as a soup or a stew, I like to use the wide mouth. So that's just a little bit of information on that. So I'm going to wash these real well with soap and water and rinse them out and have them placed into the canner where they can stay warm until I'm ready to fill the jars. Also, I have chopped some celery hearts and some of these multicolored carrots that I just love. So we have about a cup of each of those ready to go. And our ham has been simmering a little bit longer to tenderize it, and I'm going to remove that and remove the meat from the bone and chop the meat into small pieces. All right, so I let this simmer another 15 minutes or so, and it's a lot more tender. and the meat is much more falling off the bone now. So I'm going to take this out of the pot and separate the meat from the bone, and then we'll finish the rest. Okay, we're going to remove the bone. Let it cool for a minute. I think this bone has a lot of life left in it, and I'm going to throw it into my freezer for the next time I make broth. But let's put this here. Let it cool. And we are going to, remember, we have our beans still waiting. These beans have to be drained. So let's take care of that right now. Let's get the beans drained and ready to add to the soup. I'm telling you, it seems like when I can, I use every bowl and every pot and pan in the kitchen. So I've drained these beans with the colander. I did not rinse them, just drained them. And we're going to set them aside and prepare the rest of the soup ingredients and put it all together. All right, we've got our beans drained. The ham is chopped, and really chopped pretty finely. I would say no bigger than a 1/2 inch square. And the reason is because this is not a USDA tested and approved meat. Ham is a cured meat, and it's never been tested. It's possible that cured meat might be more dense than regular raw meat that you might can. So, and it's also possible that I'm using my cutting board. Who knows? I could be picking up some Clostridium spores from my cutting board. So you really want to make sure this is processed through and through, and you want to make sure the pieces are very small. Very small. And I'm going to tell you, I've been tasting this ham as I went along. This is a Costco ham, and I've been tasting it as I've been cooking here, and boy, it's so delicious. Well done, Costco. The Kirkland brand. Just delicious. I mean, I've had honey baked before at 4 or 5 times as much price, and it didn't taste any better than this ham. So it's really, really good. So let's throw everything together into our pot, and we're going to let it all boil for 5 minutes and then fill our jars. Here's another thought I had while making this recipe. I think it's better to use beans that are all a similar size, like maybe use all white beans, because I'm afraid my smaller beans in here are going to cook away, and the larger beans may not be completely done after canning. So we'll see how it goes. Here's a little thing I'm going to remove from the lima bean. So yeah, when I do this in the future, I'll probably just use all white beans that are all the same size. Here's another canning tip for you. I have a sponge that I only use to clean my canning jars. I only use it because I only use the same sponge for this, and I don't use this sponge to clean dirty dishes or anything like that because I want to cut down on the chance of contamination. So I'm going to scrub these jars out real good, rinse them well, and put them into the canner to stay warm while the soup is doing its final cook. Okay, we've got our jars warming in the canner. It's nice and toasty warm in there. And we have our broth here ready for the ingredients to be added back in. So we are going to add our drained beans. So the beans are in there. Cup of chopped celery. A cup of chopped carrots. Then we're going to add the ham back into this mixture. And it's going to cook for 5 minutes at a boil. The next step is to add the ham in and then bring this all to a boil for 5 minutes. Then we'll fill our jars. Okay, so the recipe calls for salt and pepper if desired. I'm not going to add any salt because this ham is plenty salty. You could add some peppercorns if you wanted to, or other spices at this point. We're going to bring this back up to a boil, and I may need to add some more liquid. It's pretty thick. The recipe does call for adding 4 more cups of liquid, which is about a quart, so I'm going to add another quart of water to this. And after it boils, we'll let it boil for 5 minutes and then fill our jars. Okay, we've added another quart of water. Rather than use our tap water, which has a lot of dissolved solids in our area, I'm using purified drinking water. I'm not going to add salt because Ham is naturally very salty, but I'm going to add a little bit of dried chopped chives and a tablespoon of Kirkland no salt seasoning. So we'll bring this to a boil and let it cook for 5 minutes, and then we'll fill our jars. All right, I take back what I said about adding these chopped chives because I just opened this. It's a new jar, and look, you can see it's kind of spider webby. So unfortunately, it's like a Dollar Tree spice. So I'm just going to discard this in the trash. So boo-hoo, no chives. But I did put my Kirkland seasoning in there. We're still waiting for this to come back to a boil. We've got our lids in some hot water. I've got my jar lifter. I've got a headspace measuring tool and a funnel. All very helpful to have, not completely necessary. Well, the jar lifter is really necessary because you can't handle those boiling hot jars without it. So we're ready to go as soon as the soup has boiled for 5 minutes. And while I'm waiting for things to cook, boil, or whatever in between, cleaning up the dishes as I go so I don't have a big mess at the end. So that helps a lot at the end of the canning process. As you can see, this is like an all-day project. So you want to pick a time when the kids are at school, your husband's at work, you have a day that you can just devote just to doing this, because I've been doing this session for about 3 hours and I still haven't even got to the stage where it's going into the canner yet. So it does take quite a while. Well, we've got really hot jars that just came out of the hot canner, and we're going to put hot soup into hot jars. And what I'm going to do is put a cup of the more solids in each jar to kind of equalize it out, and then we'll go back and put a cup of the liquid in each jar. So I'll take you with me as I do a couple of these. I don't want to bore you by having to watch the whole process, but just get a nice big cup of solids. We're going to put that in every jar. We pretty much fished the majority of the solids. I used about 1.5 cups of the solids in each jar, and now I'm going to just keep scooping with the more liquid portion until we're all finished. I'm just trying to equalize things among the jars here. Okay, so we just did get 6 quarts. I had to eliminate one of the, I put 7 here. I should have known I only had 6 quarts because this is a 6.5 quart stock pot. So we had 6 quarts of soup. Along the way I was able to retrieve a couple of the bay leaves. It doesn't really matter if they're left in. And now we're going to just check and make sure we have a 1-inch head space. Use your head space tool. And this is measuring to 1 inch, and we're just there at 1 inch. I'm pretty good at eyeballing it by this amount of time of canning practice. About 1 inch. Every jar is good. 1 inch to even 1.25 inches. This is a little bit over 1 inch. Same with this one, slightly more than 1 inch head space, and this one. So I might add a little teaspoon of water or something into those to make them all equal. Having the correct amount of head space is important because you want to have enough head space there so that when your jars are processing, the contents won't boil and siphon out of the jars. Or if you have too much head space, then there's a chance that you'll be left with air in your jars, and that will interfere with the proper seal. You need to have air out of your jars for them to be shelf stable. So the right amount of head space is very important. You want to make sure it's just exactly right. Not too much, or your jars won't be properly shelf stable. Not too little amount of head space, or they might tend to siphon out and boil out into your canner, especially when you're pressure canning. I'm going to take a moist towel, and you can use vinegar if you'd like, and I'm going to clean off the rims and the edges where the lids screw onto the jars, and make sure it's nice and clean. I'm going to do that to every jar. We're going to screw these on until they're fingertip tight, which is just tight enough, but not too tight. If they're too tight, your jars could break in the canner, and if they're not tight enough, you could have a lot of liquid escape. So just fingertip tight is the advice from the canning experts. Fingertip tight. All right, we're going to take each of our nice warm jars and put them right back into the canner. We have 6 jars, so that's pretty full. I could fit 7 in this canner, and that's the maximum. You like to do your loads as full as possible to ensure that the processing times work out evenly. If you have just like one jar, you don't want to process it by itself because it may cool off too quickly at the end of cooking, and it won't be safe. But I think with 6 jars, we're going to be good. Okay, we will get the lid on and get this going. We've got a little arrow there to line up. And once you've lined up your arrows and you feel the lid go down, slide it into place. Turn your heat up to about a medium high. You don't want it too high. Then we're going to wait until we see steam really coming out of here, full steam, like a locomotive, and we'll let it vent like that for 10 minutes. Okay, we've got a nice steady stream of steam there. We're going to let this steam like this for 10 minutes. Then we'll put the weight on and wait for it to come to pressure, and then we'll time it for an hour and a half. All right, our time is up, our 10 minutes of venting. We're going to put the weight on. We put our jiggler on. I have 10 pounds of pressure for my elevation. If you're at a higher elevation than 1,000 feet, you may need to put yours at 15 pounds of pressure. Check your directions. And this will take about 15-20 minutes for this to come up to pressure, and then the jiggler will start softly rocking, and then we'll set our timer for 90 minutes. And I'm going to leave this on kind of a medium-high heat. My eventual temperature when I begin processing is going to be closer to a 5 on my stove. But it's just enough to keep that jiggler gently rocking. Okay, it's been about 10-15 minutes and the jiggler is starting to rock. So I'm going to set my timer for 90 minutes. Because I have quarts. If I had pints, it would be 75 minutes. And now I'm going to adjust my heat very slightly downward. And we just want enough to just keep that rocking for the whole 90 minutes. Okay, our 90-minute processing time is completed. For 90 minutes, the weight has been rocking continually. Of course, the pin in the back is up. That just indicates that there's pressure in the canner. And so now we can turn off the heat completely. And if you have an electric stove, you probably want to move your canner off the stove, but mine is gas. So I am just going to let this slowly depressurize on its own. You want to wait until the rocker stops rocking, the pin drops, and the canner has cooled down for at least a half an hour or so, maybe 45 minutes. All right, it's been 40 minutes since I turned off the heat under the canner, and the pin just dropped, indicating that there is no longer any pressure inside. So I'm going to, now it's safe to remove the weight. And still, we're going to wait another 5 or 10 minutes before we remove the contents of the canner, because if you do it slowly, there's less chance of siphoning of the contents into your canner. So I'm going to loosen this because I have no more pressure inside. And I'm just going to leave it a little bit loose like that for another 10 minutes or so before I remove the jars. it's been over an hour total time, so we're going to remove the quartz from the canner. It's still quite hot. Everything looks good. Still bubbling away in the jars. Minimal siphonage. Very minimal. So we'll let these cool and wash off this little bit of dust on here from the hard water. Label them and put them away. So this ham and bean soup looks really good. It's been out of the canner for about an hour. And while it was cooking, I made us a casserole dinner using our leftover prime rib and our leftover French onion soup. So I'm making a separate video on that. So if you'd like to check that out, that'll be up soon. Okay, take care and we'll see you all again next time.